So the whole debate about the woman's rights, it's very difficult. It's very hard for a man to talk about this.
The idea of like male bullying too, like, well, if what men is shouldn't basically be able to commentate on this is just like standard low tier identity politics.
When it's presented as you are killing, you are murdering an unborn child, I think we do have to be very, very careful.
I think that the way that most of us think about it, an ethical way of considering all these things, murder would be the unjust killing of a human being.
It was absolutely clear for the mental health, never mind anything else, of the mother and the potential father as well.
But when he says that, refers to the mental health of the mother and the father, and then shifted it down later, a few seconds later, to the general health of. There's a shell game that's taking place even right here.
Hey, welcome to One Life Network, everybody. And so we want to discuss something that happened fairly recently, and is where our NT Wright, of all people, got in some hot water, apparently, in answering questions. He does that a lot on YouTube. People send in questions, and is typically very bright, very articulate about those things. And but this time he's gotten a conversation going around worldwide. And here at One Life Network, we really enjoy these worldview kind of conversations. And by the way, One Life Network we have One Life Network channel, and then it's also Will Hess over here, who is with The Church Split, and this is Braxton Hunter, and this is Trinity Radio. And typically we will have a guy named Chris Shadow in here. He's not here as well, but we're going to go in and we'll just look at a question was asked about the subject of abortion, and that's where we're going to pick it up.
Why should Christians defend life from the moment of conception? Why should Christians oppose abortion and stand up for the protection of unborn life? As a Christian, I was taught that abortion is a sin, regardless of the stage of pregnancy, because it violates the fifth commandment, you shall not murder. But here is my struggle. Although I have heard this argumentation many times, it somehow doesn't feel intuitive to me. Why do we believe that it is murder to abort, especially at an early stage of pregnancy, when the fetus is not even formed, the heart is not beating yet, etc.? It seems very abstract to me to say that from the moment of conception, when only two cells have met, there is life. That is just as valuable as any human being on earth. As a student, I am sometimes confronted with this issue, for example, when I come across demonstrations for women's rights on campus. And I always find it difficult because I know that as a Christian, I should be against abortion. But as I said, I often don't feel that intuitively. Also, there are these difficult ethical questions, such as what about cases where the pregnancy is a result of rape, or cases where a decision has to be made whether the mother or the unborn child should be saved. I would be grateful if you could help me to better understand the Christian reasoning on this issue. And Tom, I think we have to agree this is a difficult issue. There's a whole bunch of ethical things we've got to kind of navigate our way around. It's not a black and white issue because, you do have things like ectopic pregnancies and what you do in cases of incest that leads to pregnancy and stuff like that. So, Tom, do you have anything you want to share with Sarah?
Yeah. It is obviously hugely sensitive and difficult. And I know it's become a political hot potato as well as an ethical hot potato, particularly in America for some reason. I suspect this partly has to do with the fact that in the 50s, 60s and 70s, when the so-called sexual revolution was happening and people were casting off older restraint, many people said, well, it doesn't matter if we have sex outside marriage, because if we conceive a child, we can always have an abortion. In other words, the reaction against abortion was partly to do with the reaction against people having sex with multiple partners whenever they wanted and not caring, because we can always sort that out with an abortion, can't we? And I think many people, including many devout Christians, from then on just thought, oh, abortion, that's to do with the breakdown of family standards, with the breakdown of traditional Christian values as a whole. It became a symbol of that amoral society that was suddenly springing up, particularly in the 60s. Now, I understand that.
All right, so Pastor, you, Bret, are the oldest one among us. That comes as a huge surprise
Way to
to
call
viewers.
him out, dude.
That's right.
I'm
believe it or
sure.
not.
And so
As
maybe
good
you
as I
saw,
look.
maybe as a very young person, you saw some of the fruits of this early on in the early '80s and stuff like that. But we've just heard a little bit about the history of it, and this has become kind of a symbol, he says, to a lot of people because it was associated with the time in American history where the family was breaking down, and this was one of the ways that people saw as a way out of having to take responsibility for the family. Is there anything that jumps out at you with that?
Well, there is a couple things to his point. I do remember what was called the moral majority with Jerry Falwell, and it was a very political thing. There was a regathering, as it were, after the '60s because there was the sexual revolution that happened during the '60s in the United States. I don't remember that part. I was born in 1965. You know your history. I would have been 5 years old when the '60s ended, and the sexual revolution was late '60s, so I didn't really get to participate in that or any of that sort of thing. So there was a counter reaction, politically speaking, that happened, but that's not where the real movement of anti-abortion happened. And I'm not going off my lifetime. I'm just going off of knowing a little bit of history here. That Francis Schaeffer, who I'm a big fan of, he was the one who articulated Christian belief that engaged with the whole of culture, and he used abortion as a very good example of. The early Christians always believed that abortion was wrong, and they were known in the Roman Empire for that. They had this high view of all human life, and so they lived that out. But Francis Schaeffer kind of got everybody back to that because he was noticing that evangelicalism had separated things out to so much individual salvation that they weren't engaging in real moral issues of the day, as it were. And so that's where it comes from. I don't think it's as simple as he's saying, like, the Americans are all conservative. It was kind of led by a deeper question of, if we're really going to live this stuff out in our society, we will protect and we will go to God's word and say, well, no, conceived life is real human life and we should protect it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it reminds me of something that Will and I were talking about just a little bit ago before the show, and that is that it could, even if he's absolutely right, that this just became a sort of a symbol, or as someone would point out, maybe this just became a political issue that the right could kind of rally around at the time. It may have served those purposes and still been a horribly wicked thing that Christians need to watch out for. And so, you want to say anything else?
Yeah,
about
basically the catalyst of what caused the American Christians to be so against abortion is really neither here nor there. I mean, it's just the question is whether or not it's moral or not. That's the question that Christians are really worried about, especially in the U.S. And yeah, of course, the abortion conversation for me, I was kind of like, well, no, duh. This would be the abortion conversation would occur more so after you started saying people could have sex with whoever they want and have multiple partners and not be in a committed, marriage and familial unit. Yeah, of course, we were going to talk about abortion more so after that because guess what? It's going to become more widespread. Yeah. So just by the necessity of, well, now we have all these kids and we don't know who the parents are, whatever the dads are, and well, I don't want the baby, irresponsible free sex, boom, done. It's just, yeah, of course.
And also, judicial action happened in 1973, right? That's when Roe versus Wade was. So that came out. That was kind of on the post side of the origin of the sexual revolution. So it all kind of went together and coalesced together. But Schaeffer was kind of the philosopher, theologian behind it. And then, yeah, there was a political reaction because it had been against the law before that, in effect. And so it changed over. So people were a lot more conscious of it because before that, you didn't have to think about it, at least on a national level, in a national conversation.
Yeah, so as we go back in and look at a little more of the clip, I just want to say also as a passing note, it could be that there's also a little bit of a vibe of, look, the pendulum swang real far in one direction for whatever reasons, and then it swang in the other direction, and there's a happy middle. This can be sometimes true, but it's also what's known as the middle of the road fallacy, where if there's two extremes, then the answer always has to be somewhere in the middle, which is fallacious. Sometimes the answer is at closer to one of the extremes. So we really want to break this apart logically and see what we think about abortion as we move on. So let's listen to Wright some more.
Reaction. But then when it's presented as you are killing, you are murdering an unborn child, I think we do have to be very, very careful. And I've had personal experience of this with a close family member where soon after the couple discovered that they were pregnant, or the wife was pregnant, then it also became apparent that the wife had been accidentally exposed to German measles, rubella. Now, as we know, that exposure to German measles can result in serious deformities in the womb, etc., etc. And the GP in that case, who was a devout Christian GP, said, we're going to do the tests, and if she has been exposed to rubella, if there's a threat of serious deformation or whatever, then we will recommend termination. And I remember my heart in my mouth when I heard that and thinking, do I really agree with that? But at the time, it was absolutely clear for the mental health, never mind anything else, of the mother and the potential father as well, that this was the way to go. In fact, all was well. The rubella had not actually done what it sometimes might do, and that child was born perfectly healthy and has grown up now, etc. This was a long time ago. But that made me very sensitive about the fact that there are many, many cases where it is about the mother's health versus the health of the child.
Okay, let's stop it there. And I know you've got one in the chamber on this, Will, that you want to comment on. But let's just notice that there may be people watching this video who have had an abortion, or someone very close to them has had an abortion or considered it in his case. And I think one of the things that brings to my mind is, and this is kind of a pastoral note, but it's like when you see this happening to someone close to you, it makes you reevaluate what you thought hypothetically or on paper or whatever else. It reminds me of that scene at the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, where Indiana Jones' dad has been shot, and the only way to save him is to go get the cup of Christ. And the enemy says to Indiana Jones, it's time to ask yourself what you believe. So speak to this, Will. What do you have to say?
Well, what bothers me is right when he starts saying that, he paints this picture, which obviously, yes, health, no one wants to downplay health problems and the risk of pregnancy. Like, we know that, my daughter's 4 months old. I've seen all this go through. My first daughter, there's a lot of health issues and things we walked through before she was born. So no one wants to downplay the health issue. But when he says that, refers to the mental health of the mother and the father, and then shifted it down later, a few seconds later, to the general health of. There's a shell game that's taking place even right here, which is it about mental health or is it about physical health? So I instantly want to object there, because the mental health thing is what? So what, because of stress of what could happen? Okay, well, having kids is stressful, and pregnancy can be stressful. And I'm not saying that you don't see a therapist. I'm not saying that you don't have people walk beside you and bear that burden, but there is a shell game that's happening there.
And it becomes really subjective what health means.
And mental health, what does that even mean?
That's the problem.
Yeah. So if I'm too stressed, I can abort my baby, or if my child actually has some serious health issue, what's the degree and who gets to measure that? And it becomes far too subjective, and there's no way to actually measure whether or not a child's a child without having a good place to measure from. And the only consistent way to do that is conception. And we'll talk about how that's the only consistent line probably at the end of this video.
Now, I'm watching all this cold. So is that the statement that kind of got people talking, or is there something
It's part
else?
of it.
It's part of it.
It's part of it. It's generally
you said the mental health thing.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for people to say that, in case of the life of the mother or something like that, people will give exceptions like that because there's death on the table either way. Is it a matter of something similar to self-defense or something? But he's opening it up, as Will has just articulated, to other things, and he's going to open it up still further in just a moment.
Oh, okay. That's because the subjective issue is because once you have children, it's even more stressful. I mean, pregnancy is one thing, but man, oh man. So if you go that direction, that opens up a big can of worms right there.
Right.
But
all right, so let's just jump back in then.
Oh, that was one
real quick. Yeah. I did actually want to.
Go ahead. Yeah.
There's one part at the beginning of this clip, so I got distracted by the shell game. But the other thing that ends up that he says at the beginning is I don't think it's helpful to frame it as essentially murder or killing a child.
Right.
And I'm like, so. What do you, if someone truly believes, as I do, that an unborn child is in fact a life, what else do you call it? What would you expect us to say what it is? unless it is, because we think it's killing an actual life, then we would say it's murder. So
Well, you raise a really good point here. What do we mean by murder? I think that the way that most of us think about it, an ethical way of considering all these things, murder would be the unjust killing of a human being. So, someone says, well, sometimes murder's okay. What if you have to save your family or something? Well, that wouldn't be murder. That would be killing someone. But murder is the unjust killing. So the question is it an unjust killing? And of course, that's what we're here to discuss.
right, exactly. So
and always it goes back with all the complexities that get thrown at you. In the end, the question is around the status of the unborn.
Correct.
That's it. In the end, that's what it's about. And that kind of gauges everything from there. Human being, not human being, those kinds of things.
And as to the ending, as you say, as Will just said, we're going to come to, how to think about this logically in just a few moments. But let's go ahead and hear a little bit more about NT Wright.
Or whatever, and particularly that, as you cited, in cases of rape or in cases of incest, there may be a very, very strong argument for saying this ought never to have happened, and with sorrow, because we do not want to do this in principle, but with sorrow and a bit of shame, the best thing to do is as soon as possible to terminate this pregnancy. Now, I've seen the debates. I've read books about the debates as to at what point it's okay, or at what point it becomes not okay. And I know that in my own country, people have pushed for the legislation to be allowed to say right up to the moment before the woman is ready to give birth, that if they decide for whatever reason on an abortion, then that's okay. And that I find not only wrong but repulsive, because if you wait till the child's been born and then say, well, we didn't really want a girl this time, so we'll just get rid of her, then that would be a criminal act, and quite rightly so. That would be murder, and it would be a pagan thing. This is something we must never forget, that in the ancient world, people regularly, when they had a child they didn't want, especially if it was a girl, they left that poor child out for the wolves or the gypsies or whoever to take and do with what they wanted. The early Judeans didn't do that. The early Christians didn't do that because they valued every human being. Likewise, there were techniques of abortion in the ancient world. In fact, quite often when a woman was pregnant and the father didn't want that woman to be pregnant, the father might insist that the woman should have an abortion, which in those days was possible but often very dangerous. They would take certain drugs or have certain rather invasive medical procedures, and it makes me shudder at the thought of it. In other words, all that sort of thing went on in the ancient pagan world, and the Judeans and the Christians wouldn't have anything to do with it. Thank you very much. And I think that shows us the way, that in principle, this is not something which we should welcome. It is not something which we should collude with. At the same time, there may be certain exceptions, of which severe deformity might be one, of which certainly incest and rape would be others. And in those cases, I would say the sooner the better, because at a certain point, and I am not medically qualified to say at what point I would draw a line, then this is a viable human being that should then be cherished. And I know from experience with my own children before they were born of being aware that they were aware in the womb of noises, of pressure, of all sorts of things, and that the more we know about psychology, the more it really does appear that some of the impressions which are given to this child in the womb will re-emerge as their children and as they grow up. So we're not just talking about some inert lump of matter which we can just get rid of as we please. So the whole debate about the woman's rights, it's very difficult. It's very hard for a man to talk about this. And indeed, one of the problems has been, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, when women, particularly say a girl who's been raped or who's had incest committed on her, then discovering that unmarried men from the Catholic hierarchy are telling her what she can and can't do. That's as people now say, the optics of that are pretty bad. That's part of the same system of male bullying, which we have to avoid like the plague. However, having said that, I do think that sense of respect for God's creation in all its rich variety is the primary starting point, even if we then have to say with sorrow and a certain sense of this is the least worst option in this situation, that there may be some cases of exceptions. That's about as far as I can get at the moment. And as I say, I'm very much aware of just how sensitive this topic is politically, sociologically, as well as ethically.
Okay, anybody want to jump in on that?
According to NT Wright, to steal our producer's line, apparently sooner the better. That's his whole view is sooner the better.
I would say that's not true, but he said it twice. Okay.
Dude, it's like, so, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts on it. Of course, the idea of like male bullying too, like, well, of what men shouldn't basically be able to commentate on this is just like standard low tier identity politics, which is questions about human life is an everyone question, not a biological sex issue.
Yeah, like, do I need to get and I'm not saying this to be a jerk. It's just, do I need to have a woman come and make my argument for me so that you'll then accept it, or do you just want to respond to my argument?
Well, and usually nowadays, if a woman actually gives an answer, she's accused of internalized misogyny.
Internalized misogyny.
So there's no winning.
That's the thing, because I will say the most hardcore pro-lifers that I personally know are women. I mean, by a long shot. That's right. I've seen
my wife will throw knuckles on
my
this
wife
topic.
too. I mean, and others as well. It's very interesting that way. So it never really captured me. It is interesting. He gets into, because he states the case early on in that we are talking about murder, but the whole question, again, it goes back to status. We know for a fact that a child born right after it's born, that's murder. No one questions it. Back it up 5 seconds. Is it? Back it up 10, back it up a day, back it up a month. That's the entire question. And there is science, and because I wish I would have brought a quote here from one of my favorite authors, Nancy Pearcey, on this. She records that on the scientific side, they have quantified, everything that makes you is present at conception. The way the DNA comes together, you are just this entity that is unique at that point, and you're still just kind of moving on, and you've been you since that moment. And there's no other way to pinpoint another moment in there, even though we're trying. There
was somewhere in the question that the original person asked, they said something like that you're telling me it's life from the moment of conception? Yeah, like whatever you think about the ethics of abortion or the morality of it or your religious beliefs, it's just a fact that is life from the moment of conception.
And by the way, all biologists agree on that.
Yeah.
So when he's like, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a health professional, I can't, it's
right.
First off, it's not a scientific question.
Well, the question of is it a person is not a scientific question, right? It's a philosophical question. I would hope NT Wright would agree about that. But from the moment of, think about this, you've got male human biological material and female human biological material that comes together to make new arrangement of human biological material. That's new human life. That's what it is. The question that people want to get to is, well, yeah, but when does it have what we call personhood? When is it a person? Now, when he said, I don't know at what point we should draw that line, well, that's a big problem, and it's the reason why a lot of people who aren't totally sure are still pro-life from the moment of conception, because you're making a judgment call on that. And that's a dangerous thing to just guess about, because it could be murder. You know, if I had a booth standing in the doorway and it was painted black, and you had to get through that booth to go out into the rest of your life and enjoy life or whatever, but you could go the other way, but it's really hard to get around the other way. It's really difficult. There's obstacles there. This is a microcosm, obviously. And I said, here's a button. You can blow up that booth and you can go. Well, is there a person in that booth? Well, there might be. I really don't know for sure how to judge that. Yeah, I'll go ahead and blow up the booth. Are you kidding me? That's like the craziest thing. So if you're saying, NT Wright, I don't know at what point it becomes a person such that it would be murder to kill it, well, then you're taking a chance, and it's literally life and death. So you would err on the side of caution and not blow up the booth. That is to say, not have the abortion even from the moment of conception.
Yeah, especially now, because we do know that scientifically and biologically, and we've got the cameras and the amazing kind of, the look that they can see inside the womb, like things no one back in the early Christian days that was against this, they weren't able to see what we've seen. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing, and I think the The youngest preemie ever born was between 22 weeks and 23 weeks, something like that, but made it that far and did survive outside of the womb. And those who don't, it can be barely or something like that. Again, it goes back to status. Once you clear up the status, you can come at the problem from a completely different angle, which is what people do. I think of a friend right now that had, they knew for a fact that their child was going to have mental disabilities and those kinds of things, but had that child, and they would testify the amazing impact that that child has had on their lives, and back and forth. You can't make those judgments about meaning in advance if you think it might be inconvenient or difficult for you. You don't know what kind of impact it's going to have on you, which is really sad, because people who do abort and before they have a child, you couldn't recognize the kind of impact a child has until you have one. I mean, we can all testify to that.
That's facts. Well, the other thing is I mean, he talked about mental health earlier. I mean, you want to talk about abortion and mental health, the correlation between depression, anxiety, and even suicidal ideation, because directly related to abortion. So if a woman has an abortion, she's more likely to experience those things. And you're saying, mental health could be a big contributing factor of why we should allow for this. It's like, well, actually, what about on the other side of it? We don't think about that. So a lot of them are just kind of distracting red herrings from the question on, is it a life? And like you said, and a lot of people say that, oh, it's because you're a Christian and, you're forcing your theology on other people. It's like, yeah, of course, as a Christian, I believe God grants every life. I know life is an accidental life, that if there's life, God gave life. Whether the situation around it was horrific or whatever, it's neither here nor there. Life is God's, and God is a God of life. However, with that said and acknowledged, the idea that actually, I just totally lost my train of thought.
While you're getting your train of thought,
that was an awesome train of thought.
Yeah.
If you ever pick it up again.
But let's talk exceptions for a second. Now, we all know that it is the case that when this is discussed politically, people will use these rare cases of a life of the mother, rape and incest. Not that that doesn't happen. I know it happens, but they use those as a pry bar to allow for all kinds of abortion for all these other reasons. And we know that that's true. But notice something that NT Wright said just a moment ago. He said, when we do have to do this, it's horrific. We don't want to do that. Why is it horrific? Yep. Is it horrific because you recognize that is a person? If it's not a person, then it's just like any other material in your body, excrement or anything else. There's no problem. It's not valuable in that way. But if you're saying, no, we hate to do it because it is a person, well then, and look, I'm just saying consider this. But when you're considering like a rape or incest or something like that, just consider the fact that why does that make it suddenly not murder to interact because somebody else was raped or something. Now, I realize that is a really tough issue. You need to think through all these things. Just giving you some thoughts to think about. But did you find?
Yeah, I remember. I reached back into the recesses of my mind. And that's right. That's what I was saying. No one's forcing this on you because of our theological position. Because I understand that not everyone's a Christian. I understand not everyone's a theist. But I do know the fact that even philosophically we can argue that that's a life from the beginning. Scientifically, it shows that's a life. And if something has rights as a life, as a human being, as dignity and all the rights that has with it, then the first and foremost right of anybody is the right to life, right? I mean, that's an old cliche that people hear, the right to life, but it's true.
Well, a mental exercise that I think everybody agrees on, no matter what your religious background or non-religious background, is just imagine, say you have that preemie that did live at 22 and a half weeks, something like that, that's what we're talking about. Just reverse the process, go there, and then when you plug in all the arguments, well, I don't want the government telling me what to do. Imagine, can anyone, the mother or a doctor, go over and that baby's inside that incubator and take that baby's life separate? You would expect the government to interfere. You would expect people to think that wrong. And every single human being knows for a fact that at some point we've crossed from my choice to murder. Everybody agrees with that. There is no question, and government protected and everything else. And we say, well, the debate's over the line. Well, to your point about the black box, keep going back. What is it? Is it 22 weeks? 19
If you
weeks.
don't know, then you probably shouldn't do
Exactly.
it. Now, we just have a couple more minutes, but I just want to say this. You had mentioned that, yeah, we're Christians, but let me give you a case that I think secular, if you weren't even a Christian, you can make this case. And that is Stephen Schwartz gave this great case for what are the differences between a fetus at any level of development and an adult human already born. There are only 4 that he could point out. And in each case, if you discriminated in some way against a born human on these grounds, it would be incredibly bigoted. One of those, and he had an acronym, SLED, S-L-E-D. S is for size. Well, it's really small, just a collection of cells or something. Okay, well, my wife is smaller than me. Is she less of a person than me? Of course not. So that size shouldn't matter. Level of development, L. Well, it's not as developed as an adult human or someone out of the womb. Okay, well, my youngest daughter is not as developed as my wife. Does that mean she's less of a person? No. Environment, it's inside the womb instead of outside of it. In what other case does your environment dictate whether you're a person or not? Are people not persons or persons based on which room of the house they're in? That would be ridiculous. And D is for degree of dependence. They're dependent on the life of the mother. Okay, but there are people who are dependent on other people for life in this world, and we still consider them persons, and it would still be murder to take their life. So I think that's a case that you can run back and listen to and maybe use, but I'll kick it over to you as we kind of wind up.
And we all need to never, ever, ever forget that we were all, without exception, unborn children at one point.
Yeah,
every single one of
absolutely.
us. And we were all dependent completely and utterly. As I watch my grandkids or kids when they were born, watching every one of us puked on people's shoulders. Every one of us, cried to the point we were driving people crazy and all the rest. Every single one. I don't care how great you are, how rich you are.
Some of us in the 60s.
Everybody. This is all true. Hey, thank you very much. Did we reach all the
think so.
stuff in the conversation?
Yeah.
Okay, so be thinking about these things. Let us know what you think in the comments, and also in the comments, let us know a subject matter you'd love for us to get into, because it is a lot of fun just to engage in these things.